Picture this. You are pressed face down in a freezing swamp, praying the mud will swallow you whole. It is April 1241. Above you, the sky is black with arrows and the air tastes like copper and burning hair. The screams of your king's army are drowning in the thunders of 50,000 hooves. You are at the Battle of Mohi, and you are watching the absolute annihilation of your entire world. A Mongol rider passes so close you can smell the fermented milk on his breath and the fresh blood dripping from his curved blade. He does not see you. You survive. But as you crawl out of the marsh, days later, stepping over the mutilated corpses of your friends, your family, and your nation, you realize something worse than death. The monsters who did this are going to come back. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Mongol invasion of 1241 did not just defeat Hungary, it broke it down to the molecular level. When King Bela IV finally crept back into his kingdom after the Mongol horde mysteriously retreated, he did not return to a nation. He returned to a continental graveyard. Wolves and wild dogs were the new lords of the Hungarian plains, growing fat on the rotting flesh of the peasantry. Entire regions were wiped clean of human life. Estimates suggest that up to half of the total population, over 1 million men, women and children, were butchered, burned alive in their churches, or dragged east into permanent slavery. The trauma was absolute. It was a societal lobotomy. The Hungarian military doctrine, built on the proud, sweeping cavalry charges of their nomadic ancestors, had been fed into a meat grinder and spat out in pieces. They had brought swords to a tactical revolution and paid for it with their civilization. The Mongols had laughed at their wooden forts, burned their earthwork defences to ash, and hunted their heavy knights like crippled deer. The kingdom was left utterly defenceless. Yet the Mongols had left. They vanished back into the eastern steppes, not because they were beaten, but due to a succession crisis back in their empire. That retreat was the most dangerous illusion in medieval history. Most of Europe sighed in relief, foolishly pretending the storm was a once-in-a-lifetime anomaly. The Hungarians knew better. They knew the beast was merely resting. Fear is a strange and highly effective motivator. While a lesser nation might have simply surrendered to despair, offering tribute to the Golden Horde and waiting for the next slaughter, the survivors of Mohi made a much darker choice. They decided to mutate. King Bela looked at the smouldering ashes of his wooden cities and realized a brutal truth. The old world was dead, and if the new world was going to survive the inevitable return of the apocalypse, it needed to be made of something the Mongols could not burn. It needed to be made of stone, and it needed to be held by men who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The trauma of 1241 became the anvil upon which a new, deeply paranoid, and heavily armoured Hungary was forged. The fields were no longer viewed as just places to grow wheat. They were surveyed as potential kill zones. The psychological scar left by the Golden Horde meant that every single child born after 1241 was raised in the suffocating shadow of the horsemen. They were fed nightmare stories of demons riding out of the east, ensuring that when the time inevitably came, they would not panic like their fathers had. For the next 4 decades, the kingdom would obsessively prepare for a rematch that the rest of the world prayed would never happen. They were digging a colossal trap. They just needed the Mongols to step into it, To beat a monster, you have to become something entirely unrecognizable. For centuries, the Hungarians had been masters of the open steppe. They were born in the saddle, fighting as light horse archers, using speed and space as their primary weapons. But the slaughter of 1241 proved that playing the Mongol game on an open field meant absolute suicide. So, King Bela IV made a decision that must have felt like a profound betrayal of his own ancestors. He decided to lock his people inside boxes of stone. It was an act of extreme national paranoia. Bela issued a radical decree that permanently altered the physical and political landscape of Eastern Europe. He began giving away vast tracts of royal land to any baron, bishop, or minor warlord willing to do exactly one thing: build a castle out of solid rock. This was not some grand, optimistic public works program. It was a desperate, financially ruinous scramble for mere existence. The surviving peasants, the ones who had just crawled out of the blood-soaked mud of the Mongol invasion, were immediately put to work dragging granite up treacherous mountainsides. They starved, they broke their backs, and they died by the thousands in the freezing rain, just to build the walls that might one day save their unborn grandchildren. The scale of this architectural mutation was staggering. Before the apocalypse, Hungary possessed only a handful of stone fortresses. Within a few decades, nearly 100 of these brutal, imposing structures clawed their way into the sky. They were not designed to be beautiful. You would find no graceful spires or romantic courtyards here. They were ugly, brutally functional killing machines constructed on the highest, most inaccessible peaks the landscape had to offer. They were essentially giant, heavily fortified middle fingers pointed directly at the eastern horizon. But stone walls are completely useless without the right kind of men to hold them. The Hungarian military doctrine underwent a mutation just as violent as their architecture. The light cavalry, the fluid, hit-and-run riders that had defined Hungarian warfare for generations, were systematically sidelined. In their place rose a new, terrifying breed of killer, the heavy knight. Bela and his successors bled the royal treasury dry to import heavy Western European armor. They began breeding massive, ill-tempered war horses capable of carrying hundreds of pounds of steel. They trained their nobility to fight not with the sweeping grace of the steppe, but with the crushing, immovable gravity of a landslide. They also invested heavily in a weapon the nomadic invaders absolutely despised: the crossbow. It lacked the rapid-fire elegance of a Mongol composite bow, but it possessed a terrifying, armor-piercing kinetic energy. A terrified peasant with a few weeks of basic training could stand safely behind a stone parapet, pull a trigger, and punch a heavy steel bolt straight through the thickest silk and leather armor a Mongol warlord could afford. By the time King Ladislaus IV took the throne, Hungary was a completely different animal. Ladislaus was a chaotic, unpredictable ruler, often called Ladislaus the Cuman because of his mother's nomadic bloodline. He actually preferred the old wild ways, riding out with pagan mercenaries and constantly alienating his heavily armored castle-building barons. But regardless of his personal rebellions, he inherited the ultimate defensive grid. The trap his grandfather started was finally complete. The entire kingdom was a coiled spring of iron, rock, and unhealed generational trauma. And the waiting was the psychological torture that glued it all together. For 40 years, the watchmen on those high mountain towers stared into the east. They watched the trade routes, they interrogated merchants, and they kept their broadswords oiled. They knew the Golden Horde had not simply forgotten them. The Mongol Empire viewed the entire world in strict binary terms. You were either a conquered, broken subject, or you were a rebel waiting to be exterminated. Hungary had slipped the noose once due to sheer geopolitical luck, and the lords of the steppe were inevitably coming back to finish the job. If you want to understand how an unstoppable force gets broken, you have to look at the rot that sets in when you never lose. To the east of the Carpathian Mountains, stretching across the endless freezing steppes of modern-day Russia and Ukraine, lay the Golden Horde. By the 1280s, this western branch of the Mongol Empire was not just a state. It was a terrifying apex predator organism whose entire metabolism relied on the consumption of other civilizations. And the brain of this organism was a man named Nogai Khan. Nogai was not technically the supreme ruler of the horde, but he was its undeniable mastermind. He was a kingmaker, a scarred, one-eyed veteran of countless campaigns who manipulated Khans like disposable puppets. He commanded the absolute loyalty of tens of thousands of hardened steppe warriors. Beside him marched Talabuga, a younger, fiercely ambitious commander, eager to carve his own name into the bloody ledger of Mongol history. Together they looked at the map of Europe and saw nothing but soft, divided prey. Their perspective on Hungary was shaped entirely by the ghosts of 1241. To the Golden Horde, the Hungarians were a solved equation. They were the people who panicked, who broke ranks and who died by the hundreds of thousands in the mud of Mohi. Nogai and Talabuga did not view King Ladislaus IV as a legitimate military threat. They viewed him as a rebellious vassal who simply needed a violent reminder of his place in the food chain. To the Mongols, Eastern Europe was not a frontier to be respected. It was a pantry to be raided whenever the horde felt hungry. And in the winter of 1284, the horde was very hungry. A nomadic empire cannot sit still. If it stops conquering, it stops plundering. And if it stops plundering, the fragile alliances between rival warlords quickly collapse into civil war. They needed fresh slaves, they needed silver, and they needed grazing lands. Hungary, with its supposed wealth and weak defences, looked like the perfect victim. But here is where the greatest intelligence network of the 13th century suffered a catastrophic, fatal blind spot. The Mongols were usually masters of espionage. They utilized merchants, spies, and defectors to map out enemy territory meticulously before a single arrow was fired. Yet their arrogance completely insulated them from the truth. They believed their own mythology. They assumed that a nation they had broken so thoroughly 40 years earlier could not possibly have mutated into something dangerous. They entirely missed the stone castle revolution. The Mongol scouts who rode near the borders saw the same mountains and the same valleys, but they failed to grasp the terrifying significance of the ugly granite fortresses crowning the peaks. Furthermore, the horde prepared for the wrong kind of war. Because they expected to fight peasant levies and disorganized light cavalry on open plains, they packed accordingly. They brought their standard, terrifying swarm of horse archers. They brought speed, they brought terror. What they did not bring was heavy siege equipment. There were no massive counterweight trebuchets dragging behind their columns. There were no thousands of conscripted engineers ready to build siege towers. Why would you bring a sledgehammer when you are entirely convinced you are about to kick in a rotten wooden door? This hubris sealed their fate before they even crossed the border. Nogai and Talabuga divided their massive host into two main columns, an arrogant maneuver designed to swallow the kingdom whole in one coordinated gulp. Talabuga would strike the north, while Nogai would carve through the south. As the freezing winds of early 1285 swept across the steppes, the war drums began to beat. Over 100,000 men and horses leaned into the winter storms, completely unaware that they were not marching toward a conquest. They were marching blindly into a 50-year-old meat grinder that had been specifically designed to tear them apart. Moving 100,000 men and perhaps 3 times as many horses across a frozen continent is not a military maneuver. It is a terrifying logistical act of defiance against nature itself. In the dead of winter, early 1285, the Golden Horde began to pour through the treacherous passes of the Carpathian Mountains. They did not march to the rhythmic beating of war drums. They moved to the agonizing, endless sound of ice cracking beneath millions of hooves, a relentless churning tide of leather, steel, and hungry men. Nogai Khan and Talabuga had split their massive force, executing a classic Mongol pincer movement designed to overwhelm and envelop the kingdom. Talabuga took the northern route, aiming to choke the life out of Transylvania, while Nogai drove his horde directly into the southern heart of the Hungarian plains. They expected the brutal cold. The warriors of the eastern steppe were born in the freezing wind, accustomed to sleeping in the snow. But what they did not expect, and what began to slowly unravel their absolute confidence, was the suffocating, unnatural silence of the land they were invading. To understand the Mongol war machine, you have to understand its stomach. A steppe army did not carry cumbersome, slow-moving supply lines in the traditional Western European sense. They were a brilliant, parasitic organism. They survived by bleeding their own horses and drinking fermented mare's milk, but to sustain a prolonged, massive campaign, they absolutely needed to eat the enemy's country. They required vast oceans of grass for their mounts and terrified, pliant villages to plunder for grain, meat, and slaves. Back in 1241, Hungary had been a sprawling, all-you-can-eat buffet of undefended grain stores and panicking serfs. But as Talabuga's vanguard forced their way through the narrow, snow-choked defiles of the northern mountains, the buffet was permanently closed. The temperature plummeted. The wind howled through the jagged granite peaks, cutting right through thick layers of silk and fur. And as the horde finally broke through the tree line and looked down into the Hungarian valleys, anticipating the familiar, comforting sight of wooden farmsteads waiting to be torched, they saw nothing but death. The fields were black and barren, deliberately burned to the frozen soil by the Hungarians before the first heavy snow had even fallen. There was no grain in the silos. There was no livestock grazing in the meadows. Every sheep, every cow, and every single bushel of wheat had been meticulously erased from the map. It was a scorched earth protocol executed with the ruthless, unfeeling precision of a nation that had already survived the end of the world and had no intention of doing it again. The Mongol scouts rode frantically ahead, pushing their mounts to the brink. The horses were already beginning to lose their fat reserves, their ribs showing prominently through thick winter coats as they pawed uselessly at the frozen earth looking for grass. The scouts desperately searched for the soft, vulnerable underbelly of the kingdom to feed their dying animals. Instead, as the freezing morning fog lifted, they looked up. There, clinging to the jagged precipices like giant, malignant growths of grey rock, were the castles. They were silent, ugly, and entirely impenetrable. The Mongols stared in complete disbelief at walls that were 50 feet high and 10 feet thick. There were no terrified peasants fleeing blindly across the plains to be run down for sport. The entire population was gone, locked safely behind heavy oak doors and iron portcullises, sitting next to roaring fires, eating the very grain the Mongols were now starving for. Talabuga's men were light cavalry. They were the undisputed masters of the open field, biologically engineered to shower an enemy with armor-piercing arrows and ride away before a broadsword could even be swung. But you cannot shoot a stone wall to death. You cannot outflank a mountain. The vast, terrifying mobility of the Golden Horde had been instantly, violently neutralized by the sheer, immovable gravity of Hungarian masonry. As the bitter reality of the winter of 1285 set in, The invincible invaders realized they had not marched into a conquest. They had marched into a meticulously designed, freezing graveyard. The tactical doctrine of the Mongol Empire was built on a single, terrifying premise: an overwhelming, inescapable volume of fire. When a Mongol army encountered a target, they did not engage in honorable, face-to-face melee. They circled it. They drowned it in a manufactured hurricane of armor-piercing arrows shot from composite bows with a draw weight that would snap the arms of a modern athlete. This was the weapon system that broke China. This was the weapon that butchered the Rus. And as Talabuga's vanguard swarmed the base of the Hungarian highland fortresses, instinct simply took over. They did what they had always done. They knocked their arrows, pulled the bowstrings to their ears, and unleashed hell. But hell, it turned out, bounced right off. The sound of a massive Mongol barrage hitting a stone castle is not the satisfying, meaty thud of iron tearing through flesh and bone. It is a pathetic, chaotic clattering. It is the sound of absolute futility. Millions of expertly crafted arrows, fletched with eagle feathers and tipped with hardened steel, simply shattered against the unyielding grey granite. The Mongols fired until their fingers bled and their quivers were completely empty, painting the foot of the walls with a thick, useless carpet of broken wood. The stone did not care. The walls did not bleed. The terrifying psychological weapon that had conquered half the known world was rendered completely, embarrassingly impotent. You have to understand the profound psychological shock this inflicted on the Golden Horde. These were men who genuinely believed they were the designated punishment of God. They were apex predators who had never encountered a prey that simply refused to be eaten. Down on the frozen, muddy ground, the horses were screaming from hunger, and the riders were staring up at the parapets in a state of absolute cognitive dissonance. They were trying to solve a brutal mathematical equation that had no solution. You cannot outflank a mountain, and you cannot intimidate a rock. And then the rocks began to shoot back. King Ladislaus's grandfather had not just built walls, he had built meticulously designed kill zones. The Hungarians defending these fortresses were not the terrified, disorganized peasant levies of 1241. They were hardened, heavily armored veterans manning a weapon the Mongols fundamentally despised: the heavy European crossbow. A composite bow requires a lifetime of dedicated, grueling physical training to master. A crossbow requires a few weeks of practice and a mechanical winch. But the kinetic energy it produces is absolutely devastating. From the safety of the high towers hidden behind thick stone merlons, the Hungarian garrison took their time. They cranked back the heavy steel strings, leveled the crude, ugly weapons at the chaotic swarm of a horseman below, and squeezed the triggers. A heavy crossbow bolt does not glide through the air with the aerodynamic grace of an arrow. It punches through the atmosphere like a flying crowbar. When it hit a Mongol rider, it did not just wound him. It blew right through layers of boiled leather, silk and bone, tearing men off their saddles and pinning them to the frozen earth. The massacre at the base of the castles was not a battle. It was a one-sided industrial extermination. The Mongols could not fire high enough or with enough force to penetrate the narrow arrow slits, and they could not break down the heavy oak and iron gates. They desperately needed massive counterweight trebuchets, sappers, and thousands of conscripted engineers. But because of their sheer arrogance, they had left all of that heavy siege equipment hundreds of miles away in the steppes. They had brought the greatest light cavalry force in human history to a vertical, heavily fortified nightmare, effectively bringing a surgical scalpel to a heavy demolition site. The contrast was almost insulting. Inside the castles, the Hungarian defenders were sitting next to roaring hearths, eating salted meats and drinking wine, rotating their shifts on the wall like labourers clocking in for a day of routine work. Outside, the world's most feared conquerors were freezing to death in the mud, watching their prized, beautiful steppe ponies collapse from sheer starvation. The unbreakable momentum of the Mongol Empire had finally slammed into an immovable object, and the resulting impact was shattering the Golden Horde from the inside out. An army of 100,000 men does not die from a single glorious sword strike. It dies from mathematics, it dies from a severe, inescapable deficit of calories. The Mongol war machine was, at its core, a highly advanced biological engine. It required a constant, massive intake of fuel to keep its heart beating. In previous decades, that fuel had been involuntarily provided by the panicked, unprepared nations they trampled over. But King Ladislaus IV and his paranoid barons had rewritten the fundamental rules of engagement. They had enacted a scorched earth protocol, so absolute, so ruthlessly thorough, that it turned the entire Hungarian landscape into a weapon of mass starvation. When modern people hear the phrase scorched earth, they usually imagine a few burning wheat fields and some displaced farmers. The reality in the winter of 1285 was far more apocalyptic. The Hungarians did not just burn the harvest, they poisoned the wells and the streams with rotting animal carcasses. They slaughtered every single cow, pig and sheep they could not physically cram into their high mountain fortresses, leaving the unusable meat to freeze and spoil in the mud. They took the very concept of biological sustenance and meticulously erased it from the map. They weaponized the winter itself, essentially handing the Golden Horde over to the deadliest general in human history, the freezing cold. The first to suffer and the most catastrophic loss for the invaders were the horses. A Mongol warrior without his steppe pony is like a modern tank without its treads, a stranded, freezing and highly vulnerable target. The Mongol horses were legendary, bred to survive harsh eastern winters by pawing through deep snow to graze on the dead grass beneath. But the Hungarians had burned the grass right down to the root before the first snow had even fallen. There was absolutely nothing to paw through but black ash and frozen rock-hard dirt. Within weeks, the thunderous, apocalyptic cavalry that had terrified the known world was reduced to a pathetic, starving herd. Tens of thousands of horses began to collapse, their ribs slicing visibly through their thick winter coats, dying slowly in the freezing wind. For the Mongol soldiers, the psychological toll was completely devastating. These were proud men raised in a culture of constant forward momentum and absolute, unquestioned victory. Now they were trapped in a frozen, alien purgatory. They were forced to stare up at ugly grey stone walls they could not breach, listening to the agonizing, pitiful screams of their dying mounts. To survive, the riders had to do the unthinkable. They had to slit the throats of their own surviving horses and drink the hot blood just to keep their own fingers from freezing off. The apex predators of the medieval world were rapidly being reduced to scavenging in the mud like starving, desperate dogs. Talabuga, commanding the northern force, found himself trapped in a logistical nightmare in the Transylvanian basin. His men were dying not in a blaze of martial glory, but shivering in their own filth as dysentery and extreme exposure swept through the encamped horde. The sheer arrogance that had brought them here without supply lines was now burying them in mass, unmarked graves in the snow. This is where the true, vicious brilliance of the Hungarian strategy revealed itself. By flatly refusing to meet the Mongols on an open battlefield, they denied the horde the one thing they needed most, a decisive, crushing victory. The The Mongols thrived on the chaotic, bloody energy of open combat. They needed to break an enemy army, scatter their forces, and then aggressively plunder the undefended countryside. But there was no army to break. There was only the suffocating, freezing silence of the empty plains and the mocking safety of the heavily armed stone castles above them. Desperation breeds catastrophic mistakes. As the famine tore through the Mongol camps, their legendary discipline began to evaporate. The massive, coordinated columns commanded by Nogai and Talabuga were forced to shatter into hundreds of smaller, completely uncoordinated raiding parties. They fanned out blindly across the frozen wasteland, desperately searching for any forgotten village, any hidden stash of grain, any scrap of food to keep the nightmare at bay. They were no longer an invading army. They were a disorganized mob of starving fugitives wandering blindly through a maze specifically designed to kill them. And the Hungarians, watching patiently from the battlements, finally prepared to open their gates. There is a very specific, terrifying sound that a heavy iron portcullis makes when it is violently raised. It is the sound of a trap springing shut in reverse. For months, the Golden Horde had been shivering in the frozen mud outside the city of Pest, staring up at the unyielding walls, waiting for a surrender that never came. They were disorganized, emaciated, and physically broken by the brutal Hungarian winter and the absolute lack of forage. Nogai Khan's southern army had essentially disintegrated from a conquering horde into a sprawling, miserable refugee camp, and then the massive wooden gates of the Hungarian fortresses finally swung open. It was not a diplomatic envoy that rode out into the freezing fog. It was the physical manifestation of 40 years of hatred. King Ladislaus IV had waited patiently. He had let the winter and the scorched earth do the agonizing preliminary work. Now it was time for the harvest. Out of the gates poured the new Hungarian military doctrine, an avalanche of polished steel, muscle, and absolute kinetic fury. This was the heavy cavalry. These were not the light, agile horse archers of 1241 who had tried to outdance the Mongols on the open steppe. These were massive, ill-tempered men encased in heavy plate and chainmail, riding gigantic warhorses bred for one single, violent purpose: to carry hundreds of pounds of armor at a full gallop and deliver world-ending blunt force trauma. They were well-fed, they were warm, and they had been marinating in generational vengeance for their entire lives. The physical contrast on the battlefield was almost sickening. On one side, you had the Mongol steppe ponies. Once the legendary engines of the greatest empire on earth, they were now barely more than walking skeletons. Their ribs protruded sharply through their matted, freezing coats. They were so weak from starvation they could barely break into a trot, let alone execute the complex, swirling tactical maneuvers that made the horde invincible. Their riders, shivering and plagued by dysentery, possessed neither the physical strength to draw their heavy composite bows, nor the mobility to flee. On the other side, you had an armored tidal wave weighing thousands of tons, accelerating across the frozen plain. When the two forces collided outside Pest, it completely defied the definition of a battle. It was a mechanical erasure. The impact of a heavy cavalry charge against a stationary, unarmored target is a catastrophic event. Long ash lances punched through the frozen silk and boiled leather of the Mongol vanguard like wet paper. The sheer momentum of the massive Hungarian destriers literally trampled the starving steppe ponies into the frozen mud, snapping their brittle, malnourished bones under iron-shod hooves. The shock wave of the initial charge shattered the Mongol lines instantly. For the first time in their lives, the invincible conquerors of the East experienced the paralyzing, suffocating grip of absolute helplessness. The legendary hunters of the steppe had been violently transformed into crippled prey. They tried to retreat, but their dying horses simply collapsed underneath them. Those who fell to the ground were crushed instantly by the relentless tide of Hungarian steel. Those who tried to fight back found their curved swords bouncing harmlessly off heavy European breastplates. King Ladislaus did not just want to win, he wanted to permanently traumatize the traumatizers. His knights waded into the broken, fleeing masses of the Golden Horde, swinging heavy maces, broadswords, and poleaxes. It was an industrial-scale butcher yard. The frozen ground around Pest turned into a crimson swamp as the Hungarians systematically exterminated the very men who had once viewed them as nothing more than livestock. The invincible aura of the Mongol Empire was not just defeated that day, it was brutally, physically beaten to death in the mud by men who had finally learned how to build a bigger monster. While Nogai Khan's southern army was being systematically crushed under the iron hooves of the Hungarian heavy cavalry, the northern column commanded by Talabuga was experiencing a completely different, much slower kind of nightmare. They had marched into the Transylvanian basin expecting to loot wealthy, vulnerable settlements. Instead, they found empty, scorched earth and impenetrable stone fortresses. Now starving, plagued by disease, and having lost nearly all their horses to the freezing winter, they had to somehow turn around and march back through the Carpathian Mountains. But retreating through hostile, mountainous terrain when you have absolutely no fuel left in the biological engine of your army is not a military maneuver, it is an execution in slow motion. The Transylvanian landscape is a chaotic, jagged maze of dense pine forests, plunging ravines, and narrow, suffocating mountain passes. It might be beautiful in the summer, but in the brutal winter of 1285, it was a frozen, inescapable tomb. And the Mongols were not alone in the dark. Waiting for them in the dense tree line were the Zekalis and the Vlachs. These were the native Highlanders, fierce border guards who had lived in the shadow of the mountains for generations. They did not wear heavy plate armor, and they did not ride massive war horses. They didn't need to. They knew every single blind corner, every unstable rock face, and every frozen stream in the region. For the warriors of the Golden Horde, the defining psychological trauma of this retreat was the complete and utter inversion of their identity. The Mongols were the apex predators of the medieval world precisely because they were the ultimate hunters. They were accustomed to controlling the pace of an engagement, surrounding their enemies on open ground, and picking them apart from a comfortable distance. But in the claustrophobic defiles of Transylvania, stripped of their prized mounts and stumbling through waist-deep snow, the hunters had become the hunted. The greatest cavalry force on earth had been violently downgraded to a miserable, freezing line of exhausted infantry. The Highlanders did not offer the Mongols the dignity of a pitched battle. They fought like ghosts. As the long, disorganized column of starving invaders trudged through the narrow valleys, the Shikalis and Vlachs struck relentlessly from above. They triggered massive avalanches of snow and boulders, burying hundreds of screaming men alive in a matter of seconds. They fired lethal volleys of arrows from the impenetrable cover of the high ridges, deliberately targeting the officers and the few surviving horses, and then melted back into the shadows before the Mongols could even draw their own bowstrings. Panic, fueled by starvation and the terrifying sensation of being permanently trapped, began to completely dismantle the Horde's legendary discipline. Talabuga lost total control of his army. The retreat devolved into a desperate, feral scramble for basic survival. Men abandoned their wounded brothers to freeze in the snow. They threw away their useless plunder, their heavy weapons, and eventually their armor, just to lighten the load as they forced their deteriorating bodies up the steep mountain paths. The environment was killing them just as efficiently as the Highlanders' arrows. Severe frostbite turned their extremities black and necrotic. Violent dysentery, contracted from drinking contaminated meltwater and eating the rotting, uncooked flesh of their own dead horses, ravaged the ranks. Thousands of veteran warriors simply sat down in the snowdrifts, too weak to take another step, and froze to death in the terrifying, mocking silence of the mountains. They left a gruesome, uninterrupted trail of frozen corpses stretching for hundreds of miles, a macabre map of their failure leading out of the kingdom. Talabhuga eventually made it back to the eastern steppes, but he did not return as a conqueror. He returned with a shattered, starving remnant of the massive host he had led into the mountains just months before. The death trap of Transylvania had not just decimated his forces, it had completely stripped away the myth of Mongol invincibility. They had been swallowed whole by the landscape, chewed up by the native defenders, and violently spat back out into the cold. When the remnants of the Golden Horde finally crawled back across the Carpathian Mountains in late 1285, they did not look like the apocalypse. They looked like a bad joke. Nogai Khan, the terrifying one-eyed kingmaker of the steppe, had ridden west a few months earlier, commanding an invincible tidal wave of over 100,000 apex predators. He returned leading a pathetic, shivering parade of walking skeletons. The men were starving, riddled with frostbite and dysentery, and wearing muddy rags instead of stolen silk. Most embarrassingly, the vast majority of them were walking on foot. For a Mongol warrior, returning home without plunder is a disgrace. Returning home without your horse is a total erasure of your identity. The sheer scale of this humiliation is difficult to comprehend for an empire built entirely on the absolute certainty of victory. The Mongols had not been outmaneuvered by a brilliant strategic genius on a sunlit battlefield. They had been systematically starved to death by rocks, bad weather, and heavily armored men who simply refused to come outside and play. King Ladislaus IV had taken the greatest, most terrifying military machine on the planet and made it look utterly stupid. In the ruthless, hyper-violent political ecosystem of the Golden Horde, weakness was not just an embarrassment, it was blood in the water. A nomadic empire is a giant Ponzi scheme of violence. It requires constant expansion, constant plunder, and constant terror to buy the loyalty of rival warlords and keep the internal engine running. When an expedition of this massive magnitude fails so spectacularly, the internal alliances instantly shatter. The moment the survivors straggled into their camps on the Volga River, the aura of invincibility that insulated Nogai and his co-commander, Talabhuga, evaporated into the freezing air. Talabhuga's catastrophic failure in the Transylvanian death trap specifically marked him as a dead man walking. The wolves of the horde began to circle almost immediately. The generals and chieftains who had lost tens of thousands of their best men and prized horses to the Hungarian winter demanded a scapegoat. The humiliation of 1285 effectively lit the fuse for a brutal, cannibalistic civil war within the Golden Horde. Within a few short years, the political fallout would reach its bloody climax when Nogai orchestrated a ruthless betrayal, having Talabhuga arrested and executed by his own people to consolidate power. The Hungarian defense had not just destroyed an invading army, it had successfully exported chaos and death back into the heart of the Mongol capital. But the psychological damage inflicted on the Mongol legacy was far worse than any temporary political instability. For half a century, the Mongols had used the paralyzing terror of 1241 as an invisible, choking chain around the neck of Eastern Europe. They did not always need to fight. The mere threat of the Golden Horde mounting their horses was usually enough to extract massive tributes, slaves, and submission from terrified princes. King Ladislaus and his paranoid castle-building grandfather did not just break a Mongol army, they permanently broke that invisible chain. By exposing the horde's critical, fatal vulnerability to heavy fortifications and ruthless scorched earth tactics, Hungary published a blueprint for survival for the rest of the continent. The boogeyman had been dragged out from under the bed, beaten senseless with heavy iron maces and sent home crying with a bloody nose. The spell of terror was broken. The princes of Poland, the Rus and the Balkans looked at the staggering Hungarian victory and realized a profound, world-altering truth. The demons of the East were just flesh and blood, and if you locked your doors and burned your own fields, they would starve to death just like anyone else. The Golden Horde would launch smaller localized raids into Europe in the following decades, but the apocalyptic ambition of swallowing a European kingdom whole was permanently dead. The brutal mathematics of stone, steel, and starvation had proven far too costly. The great, unstoppable engine of the steppe had finally hit a solid, unyielding wall, forcing the masters of the world to look in the mirror and accept that some prey is simply too dangerous to swallow. History loves a good redemption arc, but the story of Hungary in 1285 is not a comforting tale of noble knights saving the day through honor and chivalry. It is a dark, gritty story of profound generational trauma weaponized into an architectural and tactical nightmare. When King Ladislaus IV and his battle-hardened barons looked down at the frozen, starving and broken remnants of the Golden Horde, bleeding out in the snow, they did not just see a defeated enemy, they saw the violent validation of 40 years of absolute paranoia. The Mongols lost this war because they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their prey. They rode into Eastern Europe expecting to fight the fragile ghosts of 1241. They anticipated encountering the same panicked, disorganized light cavalry that had been so easily butchered on the plains of Mohi. But extreme trauma has a funny way of forcing rapid, ruthless evolution. The Hungarians had learned the hardest lesson of the 13th century. You cannot negotiate with an apocalypse, and you certainly cannot outrun it. So they made the agonizing decision to mutate. They locked themselves inside ugly stone boxes, burned their own homeland to ash, and weaponized the freezing winter to do the heavy lifting for them. It is a brutal, cynical masterclass in the ugly mechanics of survival. The Golden Horde fell victim to the most dangerous enemy of any empire, their own hype. They genuinely believed that their past victories made them mathematically invincible, completely ignoring the basic, inescapable physics of warfare. You can command the most terrifying mobile cavalry force in the history of human civilization, but that mobility means absolutely nothing if your horses are starving to death in the mud and your arrows shatter against solid granite walls. Arrogance, as it turns out, is a terminal disease. It blinds you to the fact that while you were busy congratulating yourself on your last great conquest, your victim was busy in the dark, building a much heavier hammer. The legacy of this slaughter extended far beyond the borders of the Carpathian Mountains. By physically and psychologically shattering the myth of Mongol invincibility, Hungary effectively became the anvil upon which a new, resilient Europe was forged. They published a bloody, pragmatic blueprint for every other terrified kingdom on the continent. The formula was simple, unglamorous, and absolutely devastating. Stop fighting the masters of the steppe on their own terms, deny them the open field, starve their biological engine, and when they are weak, cold, and totally demoralized, open the gates and crush them under tons of heavy steel. The Golden Horde would never again attempt to swallow a European kingdom whole. The terrifying, unstoppable momentum of the East had finally been broken against the immovable, paranoid reality of Hungarian stone. So the next time you look at the ruins of a medieval castle, clinging stubbornly to a jagged mountain peak, do not just see a romantic fairy tale relic of the past. See it for what it truly was. A desperate, heavy, and brutally effective weapon. A permanent monument to the day a nation decided that they would rather eat their own scorched earth and freeze in the dark than ever bow to the monsters of the steppe again. If you made it this far, you are clearly someone who values the deep, gritty, and often uncomfortable truths of our past. If this story of survival, evolution, and brutal revenge resonated with you, please make sure you are subscribed and have the bell notification turned on. I have a lot more forgotten history to uncover with you. And before you go, I have a question for you to answer in the comments. In the brutal calculus of war, do you think Hungary's extreme, scorched earth tactics were entirely justified? Or did they inflict too much suffering on their own people to achieve victory? I will be reading your thoughts below. For those who want to understand the devastating initial invasion that caused all this trauma, click the video on your screen right now to learn about the absolute slaughter of 1241. Until next time, remember, history is not just about the past. It is a warning for the future.